me? Okay, great. Both sides of the house can probably agree that a baseline level of obligation exists to other people generally. The question in this round is therefore how far we expect individuals to go and what differentiates a moral nicety from a moral obligation. Our case is going to be that there are a series of features that are unique to severe crisis, which lowers the bar of what we can demand of individuals, or raises it rather. I'm going to be doing a few things in this speech. Firstly, some framing about what the round is about, and then talking about two different things. Firstly, why the standard of reasonable obligations shifts during a crisis, and then secondly, why doing nothing perpetuates an act of harm toward other people, and then how that interacts with obligations. Into some framing. Number one, I think that dedication would be quite a reasonably high level of expected commitment. So if you work in a business that has the capacity to shift to things like mass production during COVID, you would do that, or just spending large periods of time volunteering. Secondly, I think that your capacity to act will quite obviously be scaled toward your capacity to do so. So if you are someone who's suffering direly, this motion would apply less to you than someone who has comparatively more resources. Thirdly, severe crisis can be a variety of things, ranging from like health to natural disaster stuff. And finally, I think what a moral obligation is effectively a duty that is owed to other people. So you're not going above and beyond and acting like a hero if you choose to dedicate yourself to this, but rather it's something that we can reasonably expect of a moral actor. First claim then, why do I think that the standard of obligations shifts during a crisis? The first thing to say is that the nature of human suffering is much larger, which fundamentally shifts the utility trade-off of action versus inaction. I think that Op is going to talk about the heroism standard and how this is a nicety, but I actually think that given that the cost of inaction are so large, this makes demands on you a lot more compelling. What this looks like are elderly people and those with pre-existing health conditions literally dying of COVID because there are not enough medical resources. Things like chronic homelessness and unnecessary death that often occurs after things like earthquakes and tsunamis, when people are forced to die because of the harsh elements, or just any kind of crippling poverty that is associated with any kind of pandemic or crisis that exists. Therefore, while dedication might seem like quite a demanding bar, the costs of doing nothing are so large given how horrible severe crises actually are. What does a comparative look like on the personal level?
POI?
People can often still dedicate themselves in ways that are best suited to you as an individual. So if you are a doctor, you can help more in the medical sphere. You can specialize in things that are most suited toward your own talents and toward your own comfort level. Secondly, there is a temporary rather than permanent harm. What you could do under our side of a house is that you could only dedicate yourself for the year or two when the crisis is at its peak, versus individuals are often forced to suffer things like death, which is irreversible, or chronic kinds of health conditions because there is not intervention soon enough that can often spiral over time. Thirdly, the right to life is often something that is at stake by not helping, where people often die of pandemics and of elements, which I think is a more important right than any kind of agency that we're demanding under our side of a house, because all other rights effectively flow from that, and therefore I think that it ought to be prioritized. So I actually think that most moral intuitions about where the act of omission distinction applies does fundamentally fall down to a utility trade-off. So I think that most of us could agree in the classic example that if a child is drowning, you know how to swim, you're definitely not going to die, you have an obligation to go and save them. If you could report a violent crime of very limited personal danger toward yourself, you have an obligation to do so. If you saw a child who was just hit by a car and who was bleeding out on the street, and you can intervene at limited personal cost, you have an obligation to do all of these things. So while our side of the house intuitively sounds a lot more severe, the fundamental utility trade-off is actually not so different. Why, though, structurally, do I think that your obligation to help in these cases is more about proactive? I think that the first thing to say is that you have an obligation to act in a utile way because your moral positioning in the world is one that is quite arbitrary and random. The reason that you're in a capacity to help rather than be helped fundamentally boils down to a position of moral luck. You did not consent to the circumstance that you're in, and therefore I think that the most fair thing to do is to deprivilege yourself as a moral actor and to maximize net utility of the world overall in order to decrease how much randomness actually impacts quality of life. But secondly, I think that inaction is also involves a unique level of moral complicity in what is happening. I think that the response that is typically given to like the act of omission distinction is to basically be like, but on one side you're intending to do a moral harm, but the consequence of not doing anything is actually the same as if you did the bad thing in the first place. What typically differentiates the two things then is moral intent. But as a rational moral actor who is capable of understanding things like basic human empathy, you know that not helping is going to lead to a harm, and therefore I think that the moral demands on you are a lot higher. Before I continue, I'll take a POI.
Your claim is that there is something unique about a crisis that means you have a greater obligation to act. Yet your illustration is about crippling poverty. crippling poverty exists regardless of the crisis. Is your
Yeah,
case actually that we always have to sacrifice
even
ourselves?
something like crippling poverty is magnified during the crisis to a much larger extent because the state's often doing things like combating resources, fighting the crisis, and a lot more people end up just becoming poor. I also give you illustrations that are unique to things like pandemics as well. There's also the links to the second thing that's unique to a crisis about why the capacity for external help is something that's substantially more limited. Particularly, the state is often not in a position to be able to help these things themselves. Number one, there are often unique degrees of state failure that perpetuated a crisis in the first place. So like political instability that made things like combating pandemics in earlier stages more difficult. Secondly, is often a rapid transfer of political power right when a crisis happens, given that there's often anger and you vote out a government to get a snap election, meaning there's often a lot of volatility in that regard. Number three, the government often doesn't have enough money to deal with things like externalities due to the fact that they need to combat ordinary social problems and the cost of the crisis as well. But finally, like sometimes the cost of a crisis are just relatively insurmountable, but even if the government tries, it cannot do anything. There are two moral conclusions that flow from this. Number one, you have a much higher moral compulsion to act because the costs of not doing anything are much larger because there's no other actor in which you're able to centralize moral blame to when you're not doing anything. But secondly, I think in a world where the state capacity to help is a lot lower, the coercive power that we subsume over one another is comparatively larger because we become a lot more morally interdependent on one another for basic kinds of needs and basic degrees of help, and therefore I think you have a larger proactive obligation to help. Second major claim then, why is inaction actively harming others? The first thing to say is that within a crisis, the average person often requires a larger degree of aid from the state as well, because even if you are not dying from COVID, you are still probably suffering to a larger extent where you're experiencing things like unemployment, and therefore you often need things like more government handouts. Number two, during the crisis, you often uniquely pose a danger to other people via things like the risk of spreading infectious diseases, or even during a natural disaster, property that you might have purchased probably collapsed at some point during the crisis, meaning that you might have inadvertently harmed other people. But finally, the action of doing nothing perpetuates a social culture where a degree of complicity and inaction is seen as being okay. Given that no definitive behavioral code exists, we often judge appropriate actions dependent on what we see other people within society doing, given that we are social creatures. So by doing nothing, you contribute to a wider societal culture of apathy. This means two things. Firstly, according to a more conventional understanding of the harm principle, your choice not to act is directly constraining the rights of other people to a much larger extent, meaning that you ought to act in a particular way. But secondly, I think that insofar as we're generating harm, an increased reparative obligation is generated to society in which you are harming, meaning that you have a greater obligation to act as well. For all of these reasons, I'm proud to stand in OG.
Fantastic. I assume I'm audible. Great. Proposition's characterization in this debate is remarkably disingenuous. Many of the crises we're talked about are not temporary, and indeed they carry substantial risks. Imagine, for instance, the amount of effort one must expend in order to alleviate the climate crisis. You have to sacrifice your life to do advocacy and constantly worry about the environmental effects of every small action that you take. Similarly, in resolving the Syrian refugee crisis, the most direct way for a doctor to help is by volunteering with Doctors Without Borders. Crucially in this debate, what Proposition need to defend is a dedication towards combating the crisis. They need to show that people should forego all of the other options and opportunities in their lives, even in the circumstance that it would have marginal effect. Because remember, you're just one person trying to fight the climate crisis, and it's not clear that you really can do that much. This also means that their argument about signaling, creating a social norm of helping out, is completely irrelevant. We agree people should do something. We disagree that they ought to dedicate their lives towards it. I'm going to then talk about three different things in this speech. First, I want to talk about our stance. Second of all, I want to talk about the framing for this round. And lastly, I want to talk about two areas of constructive. First, on general obligations, the obligations that we owe to all in virtue of our shared humanity. And second, special obligations, those that we owe to those who are near and dear to us. First, on our stance, to be completely clear, we think it's intellectually dishonest to suggest that there is no obligation to resolve evils in the world. Rather, we say that there is some obligation to act, but that obligation is relatively weak compared to other competing considerations and priorities. Therefore, we simply disagree that the obligation to act is as strong as government says. One of the reasons for this is because we ultimately only think that the obligation to dedicate oneself towards a crisis comes about because other people failed their own moral obligations. If everyone mutually and collectively chose to try and resolve the climate crisis, it would be relatively easy. But because many people choose not to, individuals would have to dedicate themselves to even make a dent. And we ultimately think it is wrong to hold people accountable for the moral failings of third parties. Here's a thought experiment to flesh that out. Imagine that you're taking a bus and that 3/4 of the people do not pay the bus fare. That does not imply that you ought to pay the bus fare for all those people, because you yourself have met your obligation. It is unfair for a proposition to use this moral accounting trick and place a greater onus on people simply because other people who they could not control failed their moral obligations. Thus, I think on our side of the house, we're able to give a reasonable moral obligation to each individual person and not one that is dependent on others' moral failings. Now, some brief framing. I do want to point out that proposition needs to prove to us that we would be able to say someone is immoral for not engaging in this way, that we'd be right in condemning them and saying that they are blameworthy. And I think that is a remarkably high burden that proposition has not yet met. Second of all, as I already alluded to, proposition cannot rely on utilitarian arguments, given that one individual dedicating themselves to combat the crisis will have little effect in the grand scheme of things. So they can't rely on simply alleviating suffering as the basis for their case. Two areas of analysis then. First, on general obligations. To begin with, I want to make it very clear that the obligation that proposition places is absolutely immense. It requires one to dedicate themselves to a crisis, sacrificing their own well-being, sacrificing your ability to spend time with your daughter, the ability to pursue your passions, and even the opportunity to take a break. Now, why is this morally illegitimate? There are 4 different reasons. The first reason I want to point out here is that the problem of a moral theory being so demanding, requiring people to give so much, is that it would suggest only very few people are moral. It would create a list of perhaps 0.01% of the total population. And we think that is so counterintuitive as a conclusion that we ought to reject it on face. Let me give you a similar example. If a moral system said that murder was legitimate, we would reject that moral system because the conclusion is so abhorrent and unbelievable that we ought not buy into it. Thus, we think in a similar vein, we ought to create a moral list that actually accurately reflects our intuitions on how moral people are. Second of all, the fact that so few people can do this shows that many people lose the capacity to even actually change things. Naomi says, well, we would just gradate it so that people who have less of capacity don't have to contribute as much. Our point is that every single person has natural human foibles and motivation issues that make it impossible for them to completely dedicate themselves to this crisis for the entirety of their lives. And thus, we shouldn't hold people accountable for mistakes that they had no control over. Third of all, no thank you. There's a distinction between acts and omissions. We acknowledge that omissions do carry moral significance, but significantly less than acts. And the reason why is simple. In an act, you cause the harm that occurred. You are the reason why someone is suffering. And moreover, to hold someone accountable for an omission is to, again, manipulate the fact that there's moral luck, that you are a doctor, therefore you are the person who can fly over to Syria and engage in Doctors Without Borders. So moral luck is symmetric. Finally, I think the cost of the system is one in which you have crippling doubt and you have to constantly ask yourself whether or not what you're doing is correct. And that has a massive harm to people. So even if proposition can show you that this is a morally praiseworthy action, they did not show you that it was a moral obligation. Second of all, let's talk about special obligations. To be clear, proposition needs to demonstrate, sure, I'll take your POI.
So you are still expecting individuals to buy bus tickets for others, just fewer bus tickets according to your own moral framework. How is this morally consistent at all with your understanding of the act omission distinction?
No. Our case is that you should just pay your own bus fare and everyone should pay your own bus fare and you don't pay for other people's bus fare. That is the case of the opposition. So on special obligations, proposition needs to show that the moral imperative they demonstrate is so great that it supersedes the special obligations we hold. We have 2 different bases for these special obligations. First, reciprocity or imperative obligations, that if you engage with someone in the past and you hurt them, you ought to compensate them, or if they've helped you, you ought to repay that favor. Let me give you an illustration of this. Imagine that I punched Chin because he brought a bunch of poetry to Worlds instead of a matter binder. Now, in that world, I would argue that I ought to pay Chin back first rather than donate that money to charity because I caused that harm to Chin himself. But moreover, we think consent also generates obligations, that if you consent to take care of a child, for instance, and that child is vulnerable, you ought to prioritize them first. And these things matter more than the general obligations. But the last thing that I want to end off on is that even if you don't believe any of this, we ultimately think that each person has a right to live a fulfilling and meaningful life. That's why we have individual rights, why we give property rights, even if redistributing that property would be better for society writ large. We think we ought to maintain the basic dignity of people and give them the ability to live a flourishing life. And that's why we're remarkably proud to oppose. Thank you.
Please POI me by turning on your videos, waving, I will take you. Our case is very simple, that you generally have a moral obligation to dedicate yourself fully to a cause when you know that your action is the difference between someone else's life and death. The reason for this is manifold. Naomi gave you many, but it sums up to, it is selfish for you to arbitrarily say someone else's suffering is unimportant because you're not the one experiencing it, and moreover, because it is cruel for you to perceive another human being suffering and decide to let it continue. A crisis magnifies rather than minimizes this obligation. I think that Jason has many complaints about the case, but he tends to skirt around the content that Naomi actually brings to you. I want to frame out two of these sneaky moves before engaging with the bulk of this case. So first move is to say, well, you don't think that this applies to other ongoing crises, such as climate change or poverty. I think that the intuitive reason why human beings don't have an obligation to dedicate themselves to fighting climate change or poverty is because of other mitigating factors. For example, distance, which means that you're less proximate to these issues, which means that other competing moral claims, as they say, are comparatively more compelling to you than those. But second of all, because it's also the case that your ability to help them is perhaps slightly less. I would say that when all of these conditions are met, i.e., if I saw in a slum across my road that people are failing to have their basic human rights met because of ongoing poverty, then we would also say that there's a strong moral obligation for them to dedicate themselves to this as well. I think for these reasons, I think the first complaint on use case probably falls out of the debate. The second thing is just, I also think that their observation that you have a moral obligation to do this. However, there are other competing moral claims, which means that you perhaps also have an obligation to do other things, is a pretty big concession to our case. Our case is not that individuals have a moral obligation solely to dedicate themselves to combating this crisis, but rather they have a very, very strong one. Yes, perhaps if my child is also perhaps going through incredible pain and suffering, and my decision to combat the crisis means that they would be going through pain, I would be forced to balance these things, and perhaps I would be forced to choose my child. For example, because I'm the only person who can help them, because I'm their parent, or because I have a greater moral obligation to them, because I brought them into the world. But the bottom line is you still have this moral obligation. Before I go on, I'll take you, Jason.
Moral obligation seems to imply that it is the definitive action that one ought to take. How is it then that you can stand by such a weak moral obligation, especially given how much you've played up the problem?
So I really don't think that it's the case that you can just say moral obligations mean that this is the only moral claim in the world. I do think this is a very, very strong one. And I think unless there are extenuating circumstances where you'd be otherwise creating a similar degree of suffering, except to someone who is closer to you, for example, or who you have other greater obligations to, I would say that we would push this harm. Okay, so let me then address their main complaints about this thing of moral suffering. The first is this analogy of the bus fare, because what they say is that the reason you don't have a moral obligation to dedicate yourself to combating the crisis is because it is not just you who is complicit, but many other people as well. We would posit that the fact that you are not the cause of this crisis is not any reason why your moral obligation is less severe, because our premise is that if there is ongoing suffering, then you must alleviate it. Let me give you an analogy. Yes, perhaps you don't have an obligation to pay for other people's bus fares, but that is because, one, by taking the bus, everyone else has signed a contract promising that they will take the bus fare. But second of all, because the harms of failing to pay the bus fare are much, much less. I.e., I would say that if it is the case that one person dies every time you fail to pay the bus fare, and you know that by paying one extra person's bus fare, you're able to save that one extra life, then you would also have an equal moral obligation to pay as many bus fares as you can without inhibiting your ability to pay additional bus fares. So I would say that that actually is a great analogy for our side. But the second main claim is that, you don't have a moral obligation to dedicate yourself just because it has quite severe costs to yourself. I would say that I completely agree with Jason when he says it is really important for us to maximize the amount of human liberty and freedoms that we have. And I think that what's worse than being forced to dedicate a majority of your time and your efforts to combating a crisis, I think death is probably worse. I think being in incredibly socioeconomic constraining circumstances where you're unable to make any choices is worse. The reason why that's worse is because a moral obligation is something that you're actively choosing to do, whereas being under incredibly constrictive conditions is categorically worse. First of all, because it limits the number of things you're going to choose to do, but second of all, because it also often has biological costs to yourself, which fundamentally change your body chemistry and make it more difficult for you to live a happy and meaningful life. So for those reasons, I think it's more important that we force some people to go through stress because they are in a position of privilege otherwise, in order to mitigate far, far greater suffering for other people. The second thing is I think we would very reasonably say, fine, if it's the case that you're if it is the case that the suffering you're going through is so great that it would absolutely debilitate you and prevent you from doing any more benefits, we would say that these are a good circumstance to say that that this is necessary for you to take some time for yourself and balance things out. Okay, so I think given that, we really managed to sidestep a large amount of the ob case. I just want to reiterate why we have this more reasonable obligation, because Utah trade-offs are massive and we have relative obligations to act in Utah ways to minimize human suffering overall, which is ultimately why moral systems exist. There would never be a moral system that reasonably said that it is morally good to kill people, because moral systems were created and constructed ultimately by people who desire to minimize human suffering. But second of all, inaction breeds a degree of complicity. In the same way that you know that you have an obligation to save a drowning child, so do you have an obligation to act now. Moreover, it is also just the case that the active harms of inaction are true to a much larger extent, and you know that the consequences are dire because you understand that the state has failed, therefore that you can't rely on someone else stepping in to alleviate this harm. So why is dedication uniquely important? Dedication is necessary to set a precedent because it's about the implicit assumption that severe action is important. We also want to set a precedent of genuine change rather than a form of signaling. But two, the more you act to support a cause, the more specialization that you get in what your advocacy is, so you become a better and more effective volunteer as well. But finally, you also need a lot of time to create change, i.e. working with a patient for 1 hour and then expecting someone else to do something is going to mean that that resource ultimately benefits nobody. At the end of the day, moral systems are created to build practical ends we're very happy to propose.
Right, cool. Can everyone hear me? Okay, thanks, Jason. Number one, fan, as always. All right, let's go. I think opening government doesn't realize that dedicating your entire life to combating global crises is a Herculean task. Doctors and nurses have found themselves hooked up to respirators they used to operate. Environmental lawyers take on rapacious corporate interests by day, but find themselves worrying about rent payments by night. And activists in places like Gaza and Calais find that fighting for freedom and justice often means giving up some of your own. Make no mistake, these people are heroes. But heroism, as everyone in this debate agrees, is not a moral obligation. We do concede that you have some obligation to fight crises. But first, that this is not a strong obligation. And second, that it's outweighed by specific moral obligations that we owe to particular people. And I think that DPM's caveats on proximity and effort, are huge concessions to our case, because a large part of Jason's speech was dedicated to proving that, first of all, we tend not to be proximate by virtue of things like moral arbitrariness and also other factors like specific obligations we hold to people. So we tend not to be proximate to global crises. And second, ex ante, it's very difficult to evaluate what kind of impact we can make on a global crisis. That is to say, before the fact, when you are judging whether or not to act, it's very difficult to know what kind of impact you would have. And so it's nonsensical to say that you should only discharge your obligation when you know it will have a significantly positive effect, because this knowledge is often only gained after the fact of that action. No, thank you for the POI. I really want to talk about two things in this speech, because I think it'll make this debate way clearer. The first is a direct objection to what PM said about how the standard of reasonable obligations shifts in a crisis. And the second thing I want to discuss is this whole act on mission thing, kind of undergraduate philosophy stuff. First, on standards of reasonable obligation. We heard three things I think are quite good coming out of opening government. First, the idea that the utility suffering in a crisis is much higher. And I agree. But see, the thing is, correlatively, the effort needed to alleviate crisis conditions are also much higher. Government is engaged in some very dodgy moral mathematics. It's true that if the cost of acting and the benefits of acting were higher, so if the cost of acting were the same and the benefits of acting were higher, then obviously your obligation would be stronger. But as Jason has already shown in his speech, both the costs and the benefits in this calculation are pretty darn high, more so than we would regard everyday normal moral behavior. And so the change in utility trade-off doesn't actually generate stronger obligations. And in their failure to rebut what Jason talked about costs, I think government kind of shoots themselves in the foot when it comes to this particular point. The second thing that government told us is an argument about moral luck. But I think it's unclear when moral luck is better for government. I think if a lot of life outcomes are morally arbitrary, it must mean that it's pretty unfair to expect of someone to dedicate their entire lives to fighting a global crisis when their proximity to this crisis is also arbitrarily determined. Because no one elected, for example, to be born in the middle of a climate crisis. Quite literally, the only way we can choose not to exist in these trying times is to kill ourselves. At best, moral luck is a red herring in this debate, because all it shows is that lots of people suffer for reasons outside their moral control. It doesn't prove that the fact of people suffering for reasons outside their moral control generates a correlative duty upon everyone else to relieve the situation. And that's what gets me really frustrated, generally speaking, as a debate educator, about the use of moral arbitrariness in debates. The existence of the arbitrariness is not in itself proof that people have an obligation to alleviate said condition. The third thing that opening opposition tell us is that no other agent can act. And they pointed to, I think quite correctly, the point that states might be unable, other people are unable. But I don't think government has proved that the inability of other agents to alleviate a crisis can itself create new moral obligations. I'm sure it's been discussed to death by now, but Jason gave you the example of paying the bus fare. How do you respond to government's comeback? So I think the best way to respond is to go back to their own thought experiment on the drowning child. What about the drowning child? Right? Because surely, if everyone is walking past the drowning child, you have an obligation to save the child. And look, I agree. But the reason is that every single person walking past the child has an obligation to rescue the child. That's because rescuing the child isn't divisible. You can't save 1/10 of the child. So in this case, the inaction of bystanders has no bearing on your initial obligation. Your obligation all along was to save the child, because there's no such thing as saving 1/5 of a child, right? But a global crisis is more like a situation where there are 1,000 kids drowning in the sea and 1,000 bystanders. Now, you absolutely have an obligation to save at least one child, because if everyone saved at least one child, no child would be drowning. But you see, the thing is, once you think about this situation, you quickly come to realize that you don't have the obligation to exhaust yourself by saving the maximally optimal number of children. You don't actually. Again, if you reflect on your intuition, you don't think you have an obligation to save as many children up to the point where you are about to drown. And the reason why is because the inaction of other people does not create some kind of moral transference of obligation onto you to pick up their moral slack. And that's how I think I respond to opening government's rebuttal to our bus fare analogy. But before I go on, because I think this is really important, let's hear from DPM.
It's interesting that you're choosing to go into massive detail about costs to volunteers and glossing over the suffering that occurs during crisis. If you're characterizing suffering and crises like pandemics, like poverty as so ubiquitous, clearly there is something that is proximate to you.
Look, I agree that, again, you have some obligation to alleviate that suffering, right? So, for example, I do think that everybody in this call, myself included, have an obligation to, for example, donate a portion of our earnings to alleviate global poverty, or maybe volunteer once a week or once a month. But the operative word, as Jason has really focused on in this debate, is dedication. I don't think that you have to be a slave, to moral goodness in order to just be regarded as a moral agent, as somebody who's not evil. Because the key thing here is that we can all agree that dedicating your life is a morally heroic thing to do. But I don't think we can consequently concede that failing to dedicate creates some kind of evil judgment upon people who don't discharge that obligation. So back to my second point on omissions which are significant as acts. I think government only paints half the moral picture. Omissions are, in a very narrow sense, consequentially as important as actions. But the thing is, consequences aren't the only things that matter when we talk about moral obligations. Let's go back to the thought experiment about the drowning child. In scenario A, assume that I was the one who drowned the child because I'm an evil psychopath. And in scenario B, imagine that I walked away from the child because I'm not a confident swimmer and I was unwilling to act. If we reframe the question and ask, what costs will we apply to Chin to bring the child back to life? I think we would realize that in scenario A, we would all be okay if we killed Chin to bring the damn child back to life. But in scenario B, all of a sudden people stop and people are like, maybe we shouldn't kill Chin. Like, obviously we could impose some costs on Chin. It's not great that Chin walked away. But killing him, that's a bit much, don't we think? And we think that's entirely identical to what Jason is saying. Omissions are problematic, but they don't create overwhelming obligations. And for that reason, I am incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much to the debaters for coming for that debate. I'm sure everyone can agree that that was a fantastic round. I mean, maybe this sounds like I'm giving myself too much credit given that I was in the round, but I think it was a really good round of debate. So thank you so much to XK, Chin, and Naomi for coming to speak. It was a lovely, lovely round. And Chin, it was great taking you out of retirement and doing one more run of this thing. It's been a while since we last debated together. This was a good one.